We often think of intelligence as a single score, like a grade or an IQ level, but psychology shows that a different kind of data processing is actually more vital for long-term survival. Emotional intelligence, or EQ, is the specific cognitive ability to identify, interpret, and manage social information in real time. When this skill is missing or underdeveloped, it creates a form of invisible social blindness that can make the world feel like a confusing and hostile place. Research suggests that low EQ is the silent root cause of most chronic interpersonal friction, leading to broken marriages, failed careers, and deep-seated feelings of isolation. It isn't just about being intentionally rude. It is a fundamental failure to map the emotional landscape of the people around you. This lack of awareness leads to predictable and often destructive behavioral patterns that the individual might not even realize they are performing. If you find yourself constantly misunderstood or in conflict with others, you might be missing these critical cues that define healthy social exchange. Identifying these traits is not about labeling someone as bad, but about identifying the gaps in their psychological development. Today, we're looking at 5 specific behaviors that reveal extremely low emotional intelligence and the psychological reasons why they occur. 1. Chronic defensiveness in the face of even the mildest constructive feedback or social correction. Psychology shows that individuals with low EQ often struggle with what is known as fragile ego integration, where their self-worth is entirely tied to being right. Because they lack the emotional maturity to separate their specific actions from their core identity, any correction feels like a catastrophic personal attack. Instead of processing the validity of a suggestion, they immediately activate a primitive survival mechanism designed to protect the self from perceived shame. They may pivot to making elaborate excuses, denying the reality of the situation, or aggressively justifying their behavior to ensure they remain the hero of their own narrative. In professional environments, this creates a feedback-resistant employee who repeats the same technical mistakes because they cannot emotionally tolerate being corrected. Eventually, friends and romantic partners stop communicating their needs altogether because the resulting argument is simply too exhausting to navigate. This leads to a life of profound stagnation where growth is impossible because the gate to self-reflection is permanently locked by the ego. 2. A persistent and reflexive habit of externalizing blame for every personal failure or disappointment. Cognitive psychology identifies this as an extreme external locus of control, where the individual believes their life is governed by outside forces rather than their own choices. To a person with low EQ, a missed deadline is never a result of poor planning. It's the fault of a slow computer, a traffic jam, or a difficult manager. Taking accountability requires an advanced level of self-reflection and the ability to sit with the discomfort of having failed, which they simply haven't developed. By shifting the blame onto others, they avoid the painful cognitive dissonance that occurs when their idealized self-image clashes with the reality of their errors. This creates a toxic atmosphere of distrust in teams, as colleagues eventually realize that this person will never stand up and take responsibility for their portion of the work. The tragic real-life consequence is a total loss of agency. If you believe everything is someone else's fault, you also believe you have no power to change your circumstances. Without the courage to own the mistake, they are doomed to stay stuck in the same cycle of failure, wondering why the world is seemingly out to get them. 3. Persistent emotional tone-deafness and a chronic failure to read subtle social cues. Psychology demonstrates that over 90% of our emotional communication is delivered through nonverbal channels like posture, eye contact, and vocal microshifts. Research suggests that individuals with low EQ are often blind to what experts call nonverbal leakage, the tiny signs that reveal a person's true internal state. They may miss the tight jaw, the avoidance of eye contact, or the forced politeness that signals someone is uncomfortable or wishing to end a conversation. Because they don't process these signals effectively, they often make jokes at deeply inappropriate times or continue talking about trivial matters while the listener is visibly distressed. Cognitive psychology identifies this as a deficit in social-emotional processing, effectively a lack of bandwidth to track both words and feelings simultaneously. In real-world settings, this behavior makes the individual appear cold, abrasive, or entirely self-absorbed, even if their intentions are not malicious. The long-term consequence is a deep sense of social alienation, as others begin to avoid them to escape the awkwardness and emotional exhaustion of being misunderstood. 4. A profound deficit in affective empathy, particularly during moments of high emotional crisis in others. Psychology makes a vital distinction between cognitive empathy, knowing what someone feels, and affective empathy, feeling a resonance with that person's state. While most people with low EQ can intellectually recognize that someone is sad, they remain internally unmoved by that sadness, lacking the physical urge to comfort. Research suggests that this emotional disconnect often presents as cold logic, where the person tries to solve a tragedy with facts instead of offering presence. They might respond to a friend's grieving process with a lecture on statistics or a sudden, awkward desire to change the subject to something more comfortable for them. This lack of resonance creates a glass wall in relationships. You can see the other person, but you can never truly feel them or be felt by them. In real life, this makes it nearly impossible to form deep, secure attachments because the foundation of intimacy, shared emotional weight, is entirely missing. The result is a pattern of superficial relationships that inevitably crumble the moment life gets difficult and real support is required. 5. The habit of conversational hijacking and a total absence of active, curious listening. Psychology shows that people with low EQ view dialogue as a performance stage, rather than a mutual exchange of information and energy. They often wait for the briefest pause in your story, just to redirect the topic back to their own experiences, opinions, or achievements. If you mention a personal struggle, they might immediately counter with a one-up story about a time they suffered more, effectively erasing your experience. Research suggests this stems from a deficit in social decentering, the cognitive ability to step outside one's own perspective and value another person's reality. They are rarely trying to be actively malicious. They simply lack the cognitive bandwidth to hold space for anyone else's internal world. In real-life social settings, this behavior leaves friends and family feeling deeply devalued, unheard, and eventually, completely bored by the one-way interaction. Over time, their social circle gradually thins as people grow tired of being an audience member for someone who never bothers to ask, "How are you?" This lack of social awareness is often rooted in what developmental psychology calls cognitive egocentrism, a state usually found in early childhood. In a toddler, it is a developmental norm to believe that if they like chocolate, everyone in the world must also like chocolate. However, as the brain matures, most people develop a theory of mind, allowing them to distinguish their own internal state from that of others. For those with low emotional intelligence, this transition remains stunted, leaving them stuck in a self-centered model of reality. They operate under the assumption that their personal preferences, values, and emotional reactions are universal truths that everyone else should follow. When someone disagrees or acts differently, they don't see a valid alternative perspective. They see an error that needs to be fixed or argued away. This rigid mental framework makes collaborative work and genuine compromise nearly impossible to achieve in high-stakes environments. Ultimately, the individual remains trapped in a lonely, singular world where only one viewpoint truly exists, their own. 4. Sudden, disproportionate emotional volatility and an inability to regulate intense internal reactions. Psychology shows that this volatility often stems from a severe lack of emotional granularity, the ability to identify specific feelings with precision. People with low EQ often perceive their inner world in binary terms. They are either fine or they are exploding, with no middle ground. They fail to detect the subtle buildup of irritation, worry, or social fatigue that happens over the course of a day. Because they cannot name these smaller emotions, they lack the tools to regulate them, causing the pressure to build in secret. As a result, a minor inconvenience like a spilled drink or a brief delay can trigger an explosive outburst that seems completely unearned by the situation. Research suggests this creates a walking on eggshells dynamic, where those around them are constantly on edge, fearing the next unpredictable storm. In real life, This volatility destroys psychological safety in relationships and makes long-term career stability nearly impossible to maintain. To truly understand why this volatility occurs, we must look at the biological architecture of the human brain. Psychology shows that our emotional responses are largely governed by the amygdala, an almond-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobes. In a well-integrated brain, the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logic and decision-making, acts as a filter for these impulses. However, individuals with low EQ frequently experience what Daniel Goleman called an amygdala hijack, where the emotional brain completely bypasses the logical one. During a hijack, the brain floods the body with stress hormones, effectively shutting down the person's ability to think rationally or consider the consequences of their words. They react to social slights or minor disagreements as if they were life-threatening physical dangers, activating the fight-or-flight response. The consequence is a trail of burnt bridges and intense personal regret that often arrives too late, once the hijack has finally subsided. This biological reactivity is a hallmark of low emotional intelligence, showing a brain that is reacting rather than responding to the world. 5. A stubborn and total refusal to acknowledge or even attempt to understand any perspective that differs from their own. Cognitive psychology identifies this as the binary thinking trap, where reality is seen in absolute terms of right and wrong, with no room for nuance. Low EQ individuals often believe that their subjective emotional reality is the one and only objective truth of any given situation. If they feel slighted, they conclude that you were malicious, regardless of your actual intentions or the external facts of the matter. Research suggests this cognitive rigidity is a defense mechanism against the complexity of the social world, which can feel overwhelming to those with low EQ. In relationships, this manifests as a complete lack of empathy during conflict, as the individual is too busy litigating their own case to hear yours. They cannot hold two conflicting ideas in their mind at once, leading to a my way or the highway approach to life and love. This behavior inevitably leads to chronic loneliness, as most people eventually find the lack of mutual understanding too painful to endure. The collective impact of these 5 behaviors creates a heavy toll that extends far beyond just awkward social interactions. Research into organizational psychology shows that EQ is a better predictor of professional success than IQ, specifically in leadership roles. Without the ability to navigate social nuances, individuals with low EQ often reach a glass ceiling in their careers, regardless of their technical brilliance. In the realm of mental health, low emotional intelligence is closely linked to higher rates of anxiety, depression, and chronic stress. When you cannot identify your own feelings or understand the reactions of others, the world becomes an unpredictable and frightening place. Socially, the cost is the loss of a support network, as the individual unintentionally pushes away the very people who could help them grow. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy of rejection, reinforcing the person's belief that others are the problem, rather than their own internal skills. The first step toward breaking this cycle is the difficult but necessary admission that emotional intelligence is a skill that must be practiced. While these behaviors can be destructive, psychology offers a grounded and hopeful perspective. Emotional intelligence is not a fixed trait. Neuroplasticity suggests that the brain can rewire itself to better process social and emotional information at any age. Improving your EQ begins with small, deliberate actions, pausing before reacting, practicing active listening, and asking for honest feedback. It requires the courage to be vulnerable and the humility to admit that your perspective is just one of billions of valid internal worlds. By developing emotional granularity and learning to name your feelings, you move from a state of reactivity to a state of conscious response. This journey isn't about becoming perfect or likable to everyone. It's about building the bridge of understanding that connects you to the rest of humanity. As you grow in awareness, you'll find that the world becomes less hostile and your relationships become more resilient and meaningful. Thank you for watching. If you found this psychological breakdown helpful, consider exploring our other videos on human behavior and mental growth. Remember, the work of understanding yourself is the most important work you will ever do.